I never thought a bag of rock salt would turn into my most valuable weapon against a homeowners association. But here we are, watching a middle-aged woman named Brenda lose her mind over 3 inches of snow. My name is Brian Kowalski, and I bought my 2-story colonial in Naperville, Illinois, just outside Chicago, about 18 months ago. The house was perfect. Mature trees, quiet street, good bones. The HOA seemed like a minor annoyance at worst. I'd heard horror stories from friends about power-hungry board members, but the woman who sold me the house said they were pretty hands-off. That should have been my first warning sign. Anyone describing an HOA as hands-off is either lying or hasn't lived there long enough. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late January. I woke up to find about 3 inches of snow had fallen overnight. Nothing serious by Illinois standards, just a light dusting that would probably melt by afternoon since the temperatures were supposed to climb into the upper 30s. I made coffee, checked my work emails, and got ready for another day of remote work. My job as a software developer meant I rarely needed to leave the house during the week, which was both a blessing and a curse. Around 10 in the morning, my doorbell rang. I assumed it was a delivery, maybe the replacement keyboard I'd ordered. Instead, I found Brenda Patterson standing on my front porch, clipboard in hand, wearing a purple puffer jacket that made her look like an angry grape. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound pleasant despite the interruption. "Mr. Kowalski, I'm here on behalf of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board. I'm the president." She didn't smile. Her lips were pressed into a thin line that suggested she'd been practicing disapproval in the mirror for years. "Okay, what can I do for you?" She gestured dramatically at my front walkway. "You haven't shoveled your sidewalk. According to Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws, all walkways must be cleared within 12 hours of snowfall cessation." I looked at the sidewalk. You could still see the concrete through the thin layer of snow. It's barely 3 inches, and it's supposed to warm up this afternoon. The bylaws don't include weather-dependent exceptions. You need to shovel within the next 2 hours or you'll receive a fine. Something about her tone made my jaw tighten. "How much is the fine?" $50 for the first offense. It doubles for each subsequent violation. I wanted to argue, but she was already walking back to her silver Honda CR-V, heels clicking against my unshoveled sidewalk like a metronome of judgment. I watched her drive away, then looked at the snow again. 3 inches. Maybe less in some spots. I should have just shoveled. I know that now. But something about Brenda's attitude, the way she'd shown up at my door like some suburban enforcer, rubbed me wrong. I went back inside and did exactly nothing about the snow. 2 days later, I received a formal letter in my mailbox. The HOA was fining me $50 for failure to maintain my walkway according to community standards. The letter was printed on fancy letterhead with Meadowbrook Estates Homeowner Association emblazoned across the top in script font. Brenda's signature sat at the bottom, aggressive and looped. I paid the fine. $50 wasn't worth the headache, and I figured that would be the end of it. Winter would be over soon enough, and I could go back to ignoring the HOA like I'd successfully done for over a year. Then it snowed again. This time, it was early February, and we got about 4 inches overnight. I woke up, saw the snow, and thought about Brenda standing on my porch with her clipboard. I grabbed my snow shovel from the garage and cleared my walkway before 8 in the morning. The concrete was pristine, not a flake of snow anywhere. I even salted the steps for good measure. Brenda showed up anyway. "Mr. Kowalski," she said when I answered the door, "your sidewalk is clear, but you haven't shoveled the approach." "The approach?" She pointed to the public sidewalk that ran along the street in front of my house. Homeowners are responsible for maintaining the public sidewalk adjacent to their property. It's Section 7, Paragraph 5. That's a public sidewalk. The city maintains those, not in Meadowbrook Estates. When the development was built, the HOA entered into an agreement with the city. We maintained the sidewalks, and in exchange, the city gave us control over certain aesthetic regulations. She said this like she was explaining basic math to a child. So you're saying I need to shovel not just my walkway but also the public sidewalk? Correct. You have until noon tomorrow to comply, or you'll receive another fine. I closed the door without responding and immediately pulled up the HOA bylaws on my computer. Sure enough, buried in Section 7, Paragraph 5, was a clause about homeowner responsibility for adjacent public sidewalks. I'd never noticed it before because who reads every paragraph of HOA bylaws? But there it was, clear as day. I should have just shoveled the sidewalk. I'm not sure why I didn't. Maybe it was principle. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe I was just tired of Brenda acting like she owned the neighborhood. Whatever the reason, I let noon the next day come and go without touching the public sidewalk. The fine arrived 3 days later. Another $50. This time, the letter included a highlighted section of the bylaws and a passive-aggressive note reminding me that community standards benefit everyone. I paid this fine too, but something inside me had shifted. I started paying closer attention to the neighborhood, watching how Brenda operated. She drove through Meadowbrook Estates every morning around 9, clipboard in hand, looking for violations. I saw her stop at the Morrison house to complain about a garbage can that was visible from the street. I watched her leave a note on David Chen's door about his lawn height, even though it was February and nobody's lawn was growing. Brenda wasn't enforcing rules to maintain property values or keep the neighborhood nice. She was on a power trip, plain and simple, and I'd become her latest target. The third snowfall came in mid-February. This one was bigger, almost 8 inches overnight, and the temperature dropped into the single digits. Real winter weather. The kind that made you want to stay inside with hot coffee and avoid the outdoors entirely. I bundled up and went outside to shovel. My walkway took about 20 minutes. Then I moved to the public sidewalk. The snow was heavy and wet, the kind that makes your back ache after the first few scoops. I was about halfway done when Brenda pulled up in her CR-V. She rolled down her window. "Good morning, Mr. Kowalski. Nice to see you taking your responsibilities seriously." I didn't respond. I just kept shoveling, tossing snow into the growing pile on my lawn. Make sure you salt everything when you're done. Icy conditions are also a violation. She drove off before I could tell her exactly what she could do with her salt. I finished shoveling, went inside, and decided I'd had enough. If Brenda wanted to play games with the HOA bylaws, I could play too. That evening, I read through all 47 pages of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA bylaws. Every single paragraph, every clause, every ridiculous rule that nobody probably remembered existed. And buried in Section 12, I found something interesting. Paragraph 8 stated that HOA board members were required to maintain their properties to a higher standard than regular homeowners. Any violation that would result in a fine for a homeowner would result in double the fine for a board member, and repeated violations could result in removal from the board. I started watching Brenda's house. She lived 4 streets over in a larger colonial with pretentious columns flanking the front door. Her lawn was immaculate in summer, her holiday decorations always tasteful and timely. But winter was less forgiving, and on February 23rd, we got another snowfall. 6 inches this time, coming down fast in the early morning hours. I woke up at 6, shoveled my walkway and the public sidewalk by 7, and then took a walk through the neighborhood with my phone. I reached Brenda's house at 8:30. Her walkway was clear, but the public sidewalk in front of her house was still covered in snow. According to the bylaws, she had until 12 hours after snowfall cessation, which meant she had until about 10 in the morning. I came back at 11. The sidewalk was still snow-covered. I took photos, making sure to capture the timestamps and the address clearly visible in the frame. Then I went home and drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board, citing Section 7, Paragraph 5 and Section 12, Paragraph 8. I included the photos and sent the email to the general HOA address listed on the website. Brenda called me 2 hours later. "This is harassment, Mr. Kowalski. I'm just ensuring community standards are maintained. Isn't that what you've been doing?" I was out of town. I had a family emergency. The bylaws don't include personal emergency exceptions. You told me that yourself. I kept my voice calm, professional. She hung up without another word. The HOA board meeting was the following Tuesday. These meetings were supposedly open to all homeowners, though nobody usually attended except the board members and whoever was being fined that month. I showed up at 7 p.m. sharp, walked into the community center conference room, and took a seat in the back. Brenda sat at the head of the table with 4 other board members. I recognized 2 of them: Mark Stevens, a retired accountant who lived on my street, and Patricia Donnelly, a real estate agent who always wore too much perfume. The other 2 were younger, probably in their 30s, and looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Kowalski," Brenda said, acknowledging me with a nod. "Here to observe, here to ensure my complaint is properly addressed." Her jaw tightened. "We'll get to that in due course." The meeting started with routine business: budget reports, landscaping contract renewals, discussion about the summer pool schedule. 45 minutes of mind-numbing minutiae that made me understand why nobody attended these meetings. Finally, Brenda cleared her throat. "We have one formal complaint to address. Mr. Kowalski has alleged that I violated Section 7, Paragraph 5 during the snowfall on February 23rd. "I didn't allege," I said from the back of the room. "I documented. I have time-stamped photos showing your public sidewalk wasn't cleared within the required time frame." Mark Stevens spoke up. "Brenda, is this true?" I was dealing with a family situation. My sister was in the hospital in Springfield. I left early in the morning and didn't return until late afternoon. "I'm sorry about your sister," I said, and I meant it. "But you've told me repeatedly that the bylaws don't include exceptions for personal circumstances. Either the rules apply to everyone, or they don't mean anything." Patricia Donnelly looked between Brenda and me like she was watching a tennis match. "Brian has a point. We can't enforce rules selectively." "I'm not suggesting we do," Brenda said quickly. "I'm happy to pay the fine. $100, correct, since board members are held to a higher standard. The bylaws also state that repeated violations can result in removal from the board," I added. "This would be your second documented violation this winter. There was also the incident on January 30th, when your Christmas wreath was still up past the January 15th deadline." "I have photos of that too." The room went silent. Brenda's face had turned an impressive shade of red. "You've been stalking my house." "I've been walking through a public neighborhood and documenting HOA violations, just like you do every morning." "It's not stalking when you're doing your civic duty, right?" One of the younger board members, a guy with glasses and a nervous laugh, spoke up. "Maybe we should table this discussion for now and revisit our enforcement policies. It seems like there might be some inconsistencies." "Great idea," I said, standing up. "While you're revisiting policies, Maybe consider whether fining people for 3 inches of snow that melts by afternoon is really in the community's best interest. I left before anyone could respond. As I walked to my car, I felt pretty good about myself. I'd made my point, defended myself, and maybe even planted seeds of doubt about Brenda's leadership. That good feeling lasted exactly 4 days. On Saturday morning, I found another letter in my mailbox. This time, I was being fined $75 for excessive snow pile accumulation on my front lawn. The letter explained that while homeowners were required to remove snow from walkways, we weren't supposed to pile it in visible areas where it created aesthetic disruption. I looked at my front lawn. Yes, there was a pile of snow, because I'd shoveled my walkway and sidewalk multiple times and had to put the snow somewhere. Everyone on the street had similar piles, but I was the only one getting fined. Something inside me snapped. Not in an angry way, but in a calculated way. If Brenda wanted to play dirty, if she wanted to abuse her position to harass me because I'd called out her hypocrisy, then I would stop playing her game entirely. The next snowfall came on March 2nd, 4 inches overnight, light and fluffy. I woke up, made my coffee, checked my emails, and didn't touch my snow shovel. The snow sat on my walkway and the public sidewalk, pristine and undisturbed. By noon, Brenda's CRV was in my driveway. She didn't bother knocking. She just left a note on my door threatening immediate fines if I didn't comply within 2 hours. I threw the note away and went back to work. The fine arrived on Monday, $50. I didn't pay it. On Tuesday, Brenda called. "Mr. Kowalski, we haven't received your payment for the March 2nd violation. I'm not paying it. You're required to pay all fines within 30 days. Here's the thing, Brenda. I've been reading the bylaws more carefully. Section 7, paragraph 3 states that homeowners must maintain walkways for safe passage. But it doesn't actually define what constitutes safe passage, and it doesn't specify the exact time frame. The 12-hour rule you keep citing. That's from an addendum passed in 2018, and according to Section 20, paragraph 2, all addendums require a majority vote of homeowners to be valid. I checked the records. Only 42% of homeowners voted on that addendum. Silence on the other end of the line. So technically, I continued, that addendum isn't valid, which means you've been enforcing a rule that doesn't legally exist, which means every fine you've issued for snow removal timing is invalid, which means you owe me and probably a dozen other homeowners refunds. That's not how this works, Brenda said, but her voice had lost its certainty. Get a lawyer and we'll find out. She hung up. I felt pretty good until that evening when I realized I might have just started a war I wasn't prepared to fight. HOA boards had legal resources. They had budgets and lawyers on retainer. I had Google and stubbornness. But I'd committed to this path, so I kept walking it. The next snowfall came on March 9th. 7 inches, heavy and wet. The kind that would take an hour to shovel properly. I let it sit. My walkway disappeared under a blanket of white. The public sidewalk became impassable. I didn't care. Brenda's notes appeared daily. Different colored paper, increasingly aggressive language, threats of legal action. I collected them in a folder and kept working. The fines piled up. $50. Another 50. Then 100 when they claimed it was a repeated violation. I didn't pay any of them. And then, on March 15th, something unexpected happened. My mail carrier stopped delivering mail. I didn't notice at first. I don't get much physical mail anymore. Most bills are electronic and packages get left at the door. But after 3 days of nothing in my mailbox, I started to wonder. On the 4th day, I checked the USP's website and found a notice. Delivery temporarily suspended due to unsafe access conditions. I called the local post office. A tired-sounding woman answered. Naperville, Maine, how can I help you? Hi, I'm calling about a delivery suspension at my address. I haven't received mail in 4 days. What's your address? I gave it to her. I heard typing, then a long pause. Okay, so it looks like your carrier reported unsafe conditions. Snow and ice blocking access to your mailbox. My mailbox is at the street. There's no snow blocking it. According to the notes, the walkway from the street to your mailbox is impassable. The carrier can't safely access it. The mailbox is literally right at the street. You don't need to walk up my walkway to reach it. More typing. I'm just reading what the carrier reported. If you want to dispute it, you'll need to clear the access path and then contact your carrier directly to request resumption of service. Who's my carrier? I can't give out personal information about our employees. Can you at least tell them I called? I'll make a note in the system. She hung up before I could argue further. I went outside and looked at my mailbox. Standard black box mounted on a post at the end of my driveway, maybe 10 feet from the street. The driveway was clear because I'd been driving on it daily. There was absolutely no reason a mail carrier couldn't access it, unless the mail carrier had been told not to access it. I checked with my neighbors. The Morrisons were getting mail, so were the Chens. I was the only house on the street with suspended delivery. That's when I realized what Brenda had done. She'd either convinced or pressured my mail carrier to report unsafe conditions. It was a petty, ridiculous move that probably violated about 6 different postal regulations. But it was also effective. Without mail delivery, I wasn't getting official notices, bills, or any correspondence the HOA might send. 2 could play at that game. I spent that evening researching USP's regulations and found something interesting. Mail carriers are required to report unsafe conditions, but those reports are supposed to be specific and documented with photos. If a carrier falsely reports unsafe conditions, they can face disciplinary action. And if someone influences a carrier to falsely report conditions, that's mail fraud, which is a federal offense. I filed a formal complaint with the USP's Office of Inspector General. I included photos of my mailbox and driveway, showing clear access. I documented the dates of the suspension and noted that no other houses on my street were affected. And I mentioned that I was currently in a dispute with my HOA president, who had been citing me for snow removal violations. Then I filed a complaint with the HOA board, bypassing Brenda entirely and sending it directly to the other 4 members. I explained the mail situation and suggested that if Brenda had interfered with federal mail delivery to harass a homeowner, she might be exposing the entire HOA to legal liability. Patricia Donnelly called me the next morning. Brian, I got your email. This is concerning. That's putting it mildly. I want to be clear that the board as a whole didn't authorize any interference with mail delivery. If Brenda did something on her own, that's not representative of our position. So you're saying it's possible she did this? Patricia hesitated. I'm saying I don't know what happened, but we're going to look into it. In the meantime, can you please just shovel your walkway? This whole situation has gotten out of hand. I'll shovel my walkway when the HOA refunds every invalid fine and removes Brenda from the board. Brian, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. Brenda has been abusing her position to harass me because I called her out for hypocrisy. Now she's apparently interfering with federal mail delivery. How is any of that reasonable? Patricia sighed. I'll talk to the board. Just please don't escalate this further. I didn't promise anything. I just hung up and went back to my research. The mail situation continued for another week. No delivery, despite my calls to the post office and my formal complaints. I started having important packages shipped to my office in Chicago, making the drive twice a week to pick them up. It was annoying, but I'd committed to this fight. Then, on March 22nd, I got a call from an investigator with the USP's Office of Inspector General. His name was Agent Robert Mendez, and he had the kind of voice that suggested he'd interviewed a lot of people who tried to lie to him. "Mr. Kowalski, I'm following up on your complaint regarding suspended mail delivery. Can you walk me through the situation?" I explained everything. The HOA disputes, Brenda's escalating fines, the sudden mail suspension, my belief that Brenda had influenced my carrier. "You have any direct evidence that Miss Patterson interfered with mail delivery?" "No," I admitted, "but the timing is suspicious. I've been in dispute with her for 2 months, and suddenly my mail stops because of unsafe conditions that don't actually exist. I've reviewed the carrier's report and the photos you submitted. You're right that there doesn't appear to be any safety issue with accessing your mailbox. I'm going to interview your carrier and get more information. If we find evidence of false reporting or outside influence, we'll take appropriate action." "What kind of action?" "That depends on what we find. Could range from retraining to criminal charges if there's evidence of mail fraud." After Agent Mendez hung up, I felt a mix of satisfaction and concern. I wanted to prove Brenda was abusing her power, but I hadn't necessarily wanted to get anyone arrested. The mail carrier might have just been following orders from a supervisor who'd been pressured by Brenda. There were layers to this that I was only beginning to understand. 3 days later, my mail delivery resumed. No explanation, no apology. Letters and catalogs just started appearing in my mailbox again like nothing had happened. I received a brief email from Agent Mendez stating that the investigation was ongoing and he'd contact me if he needed additional information. I also received a certified letter from the HOA board. Not from Brenda, but signed by all 5 members. It stated that they were reviewing enforcement procedures, and that all pending fines against my property were temporarily suspended pending policy clarification. It was lawyer speak for "please stop making trouble while we figure out how to cover our asses." I should have accepted the olive branch. I should have shoveled my walkway and moved on with my life. But something about that letter, the careful wording and the lack of any actual apology, bothered me. They weren't sorry for what Brenda had done. They were just scared of the consequences. So I kept my walkway unshoveled. March in Illinois meant more snow was coming, and I intended to make my point as clearly as possible. The next snowfall came on March 27th. Only 3 inches, but it was enough. I let it accumulate on my walkway and the public sidewalk. I watched from my window as neighbors shoveled their driveways and sidewalks, probably wondering what the hell I was doing. David Chen knocked on my door that afternoon. He was a nice guy, an engineer at Caterpillar's facility in the area. We'd had a few conversations over the fence about lawn care and property values. "Hey Brian, everything okay? I noticed you haven't been shoveling." "Everything's fine, just making a point about the HOA." "Yeah," he glanced back at his own house. "Look, I get it. Brenda's intense. She fined me twice last year for stupid stuff. But this snow situation, it's getting noticed. People are talking. Let them talk. I'm just saying maybe there's a better way to handle this. Come to the next board meeting, voice your concerns, get other homeowners involved." I tried that. Brenda just escalated. David nodded slowly. "Well, for what it's worth, I think a lot of people agree with you about the enforcement being too strict. Maybe if we organized, got a group together, we could vote her out." That got my attention. "You think people would actually do that?" I know at least 5 homeowners who have complained about her, maybe more if we asked around. The bylaws allow for a recall vote if we get 25% of homeowners to sign a petition. I invited David inside, and we spent the next hour talking strategy. He pulled up the HOA bylaws on his laptop, and we went through the recall process step by step. We needed signatures from at least 40 homeowners, which was 25% of the 161 total properties in Meadowbrook Estates. Then the board would be required to hold a special election within 30 days. We could actually do this, I said, feeling energized for the first time in weeks. We'd need to move fast, and we'd need to be organized. Brenda's going to fight this hard. I've been fighting her alone for 2 months. I can handle a few more weeks. We decided to start reaching out to homeowners we knew had issues with Brenda's enforcement. David knew several families on his street. I knew the Morrisons and a few others. We'd divide up the neighborhood and start gathering signatures. But before we could launch our recall campaign, everything changed. On April 2nd, Agent Mendez called again. "Mr. Kowalski, I wanted to update you on our investigation. We've completed interviews with your mail carrier and several postal supervisors. And your carrier, a woman named Susan Hartley, admitted that she was approached by Brenda Patterson 3 times in March. Miss Patterson told her that your property was dangerous and that she should report unsafe conditions. Miss Hartley initially resisted, but Miss Patterson became increasingly insistent. She told Miss Hartley that, as HOA president, she had authority to determine what constituted safe conditions in the neighborhood. So Brenda did pressure her. It appears that way. However, Miss Hartley also admitted that she should have verified the conditions herself rather than taking Miss Patterson's word for it. She's been issued a formal reprimand for filing a false safety report. What about Brenda? Is that mail fraud? That's where it gets complicated. Influencing a carrier to file a false report could potentially be prosecuted as mail fraud under federal statute 18 U.S.C. 1501. However, the U.S. Attorney's Office typically doesn't pursue charges unless there's evidence of financial gain or significant harm. In this case, while Miss Patterson's actions were inappropriate and potentially illegal, prosecuting her would be difficult. I felt my frustration rising. So she just gets away with it? Not exactly. We're referring the case to local law enforcement. While it might not meet the threshold for federal mail fraud prosecution, her actions could potentially constitute harassment or interference with a government function under Illinois state law. That's for the Naperville Police Department to determine. So the police are going to get involved. They already have been notified. I'd expect a detective to contact you within the next few days. After Agent Mendez hung up, I sat in my kitchen trying to process everything. What had started as a dispute over snow shoveling had turned into a federal investigation and potential criminal charges. Part of me felt vindicated. Brenda had abused her power, and now she was facing real consequences. But part of me also felt uncomfortable. I'd never intended for this to become a criminal matter. Detective Sarah Martinez from the Naperville Police Department called me 2 days later. She had a calm, professional voice that put me somewhat at ease. We arranged to meet at my house that afternoon. Detective Martinez arrived in an unmarked sedan, wearing a blazer and slacks. She looked to be in her 40s with short, dark hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything. I offered her coffee, which she declined, and we sat in my living room while she took notes. "So, Mr. Kowalski, I've read the report from the Postal Inspector's office. I'd like to hear your version of events in your own words." I walked her through everything. The initial snow removal disputes, Brenda's escalating enforcement, my complaint about her own violations, the mail suspension, and my suspicion that she'd interfered with delivery. The postal inspector confirmed that Miss Patterson pressured your mail carrier to file a false report. That's the key issue from a criminal perspective. In Illinois, knowingly making a false report to a government official can be charged as disorderly conduct or obstruction, depending on the circumstances. Are you going to arrest her? Not immediately. First, I need to interview Miss Patterson and get her statement. If she admits to the conduct and it's a first offense, the state's attorney might offer a plea deal or deferred prosecution. If she denies it, or we find evidence of a pattern of behavior, charges become more likely. There's definitely a pattern, I said. She's been abusing her position as HOA president to harass homeowners for months. I have documentation. Detective Martinez spent the next hour reviewing everything I'd collected. The fines, the emails, the photos, the notes Brenda had left on my door. She took copies of everything and said she'd be in touch. Word spread through Meadowbrook Estates quickly. Within days, everyone knew that the police were investigating Brenda. I started getting calls and emails from neighbors. Some were supportive, thanking me for standing up to her. Others were critical, saying I'd overreacted and turned a minor dispute into a criminal matter. David Chen and I pushed forward with the recall petition anyway. We figured that even if criminal charges didn't stick, Brenda had lost the moral authority to lead the HOA. We spent evenings and weekends knocking on doors, explaining the situation and gathering signatures. Most people signed willingly. The Morrisons signed immediately. A retired couple named the Bradshaws signed and told me about being fined $300 last year for parking an RV in their driveway for 2 days while they unloaded it from a trip. A young family on Oak Street signed and described being harassed about their children's toys being visible in the yard. By mid-April, we had 63 signatures, more than enough to trigger a recall election. David and I submitted the petition to the HOA board, addressed to the 4 members other than Brenda, and waited. The board responded within a week. They scheduled a special election for May 15th and sent notice to all homeowners. Brenda would face a vote of confidence. If more than 50% of voting homeowners voted no confidence, she would be removed from the board immediately. I expected Brenda to campaign, to defend herself, to argue that she'd been enforcing rules fairly. Instead, she went silent. Her CRV stopped making morning rounds through the neighborhood. The notes and fines stopped. She didn't attend the regular April board meeting. Detective Martinez called me on April 28th. "Mr. Kowalski, I wanted to update you. I interviewed Miss Patterson last week. She initially denied pressuring the mail carrier, but eventually admitted to speaking with her about concerns regarding your property. She claimed she was only trying to protect the carrier's safety." "That's ridiculous. My mailbox is completely accessible." "I know. I've seen the photos." But here's where it gets interesting. During the interview, Miss Patterson became increasingly agitated. She made several statements suggesting she believed she had authority over neighborhood residents as HOA president. She also admitted to keeping detailed files on various homeowners, including photographs and notes about their daily activities. That's creepy. It's also potentially stalking behavior. I obtained a warrant to search her home and office. We found extensive files on not just you, but at least 20 other homeowners. Photos taken from public streets, yes, but also notes about when people come and go, visitors they have, and perceived violations of HOA rules. Some of this documentation goes back 3 years. I felt a chill run through me. What does that mean legally? Illinois stalking law requires proof that the defendant engaged in a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for their safety or suffer emotional distress. The fact that she was documenting multiple people actually works in her favor from a stalking perspective, because it's harder to prove she was targeting specific individuals. However, the state's attorney is reviewing everything for potential charges of disorderly conduct and official misconduct. Official misconduct. She's not a government official. HOA boards in Illinois have certain quasi-governmental powers when it comes to property enforcement. If she abused those powers for personal reasons or to harass homeowners, it could potentially qualify. It's a stretch, but the state's attorney is considering it. The special election on May 15th had a huge turnout. Normally, HOA elections got maybe 30% participation. This time, over 100 homeowners showed up at the community center to vote. The energy in the room was tense. People clustered in groups, talking in low voices. Some wore "Support Brenda" buttons, though I couldn't figure out where they'd gotten them since she wasn't campaigning. Most people just looked tired of the drama. Brenda herself showed up, which surprised me. She sat in the back corner, purple puffer jacket despite the warm weather, looking smaller than usual. Her husband sat next to her, a quiet man named Gerald who I'd seen maybe twice in 2 years. He looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to be anywhere else. The vote was simple. Paper ballots with 2 options: confidence or no confidence in Brenda Patterson as HOA board president. Mark Stevens, as vice president, oversaw the count. 4 volunteers helped him, and David and I observed to ensure transparency. It took an hour to count all the ballots. The community center grew quieter as Mark tallied the votes, writing numbers on a whiteboard at the front of the room. When he finished, he cleared his throat. Total ballots cast: 103, for confidence, 27, for no confidence, 76. The motion of no confidence passes. Effective immediately, Brenda Patterson is removed from her position as board president and from the HOA board. The room erupted in a mix of applause and gasps. I watched Brenda's face. She didn't cry or yell. She just stood up, took Gerald's hand, and walked out of the community center without a word. Something about her exit made me feel a small twinge of sympathy despite everything. Mark continued speaking. Per the bylaws, I'll serve as interim president until we can hold a special election to fill the vacant board seat. In the meantime, the board will be reviewing all enforcement policies and considering significant reforms. After the meeting, dozens of homeowners came up to shake my hand or thank me. David beamed like we just won the Super Bowl. Patricia Donnelly pulled me aside. "Brian, I want to apologize. I should have recognized what Brenda was doing months ago. The board failed in our oversight responsibility." "I appreciate that. I just want things to go back to normal." "They will. And I promise we're going to make changes. No more harassment over minor violations. No more selective enforcement." I went home that night feeling genuinely good for the first time in months. The snow had long since melted, and my lawn was starting to green up. Spring had arrived, and with it, the promise of a more reasonable HOA. But the criminal case wasn't over. On June 3rd, I received a call from the DuPage County State's Attorney's Office. A prosecutor named Jennifer Walsh wanted to discuss the charges against Brenda Patterson. "Mr. Kowalski, we've reviewed all the evidence gathered by Detective Martinez and the Postal Inspector's Office. We've decided to charge Miss Patterson with 1 count of disorderly conduct and 1 count of harassment. Both are misdemeanors. Not mail fraud," the federal prosecutors declined. "And honestly, the state charges are more appropriate given the circumstances. Disorderly conduct covers the false report to the mail carrier. Harassment covers the pattern of behavior documented in her files. What happens now? She'll be arraigned next week. She can either plead guilty and likely receive probation and community service, or she can fight the charges and go to trial. Either way, I wanted to let you know you might be called as a witness. I'm willing to testify if needed. The arraignment was on June 10th. I didn't attend, but David Chen did and texted me updates. Brenda showed up with a lawyer, an expensive-looking guy in a three-piece suit. She pleaded not guilty to both charges. The judge set a trial date for August 4th. Over the next 2 months, life in Meadowbrook Estates slowly returned to normal. Mark Stevens proved to be a reasonable and fair HOA president. He sent out a newsletter apologizing for the previous board's overzealous enforcement and announcing new policies. Fines would only be issued for serious violations that affected property values or safety. Minor infractions would receive friendly warnings first. And homeowners would have the right to appeal any fine to the full board before payment was required. I shoveled my walkway that winter, but only because it made sense to do so, not because I feared some vindictive fine. The mail carrier, Susan Hartley, continued her route but never made eye contact with me. I didn't blame her. She'd been caught between a pushy HOA president and postal regulations, and she'd made a bad choice. She'd been reprimanded and learned her lesson. The trial in August was anticlimactic. I testified on the second day, describing the snow disputes, the escalating fines, and the mail suspension. Brenda's lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive and overly litigious, but the prosecutor had too much evidence. The files Brenda had kept on homeowners were particularly damaging. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on both counts. The judge sentenced Brenda to 1 year of probation, 100 hours of community service, and a $500 fine. He also issued a restraining order prohibiting her from contacting me or serving in any HOA leadership position for 5 years. It wasn't prison, but it was enough to make clear that her behavior had been unacceptable. I saw Brenda one more time after the trial. It was September, and I was mowing my lawn. She drove past in her silver CR-V, slower than usual, and our eyes met for just a moment. She looked older, tired. I wondered if she'd ever understood why what she'd done was wrong, or if she still believed she'd been enforcing necessary rules. I didn't wave, neither did she. She just drove on, and I went back to mowing. David Chen and I became good friends through all of this. We started a tradition of Saturday morning coffee at a local place, discussing everything from work to family to neighborhood gossip. He ran for the vacant board seat in October and won easily. With him and Mark Stevens leading the HOA, things actually improved. They focused on real issues like maintaining the community pool and organizing neighborhood events, not measuring grass height with rulers. Looking back on the whole situation, I'm not sure I handled everything perfectly. Maybe I should have just shoveled my snow and found a different way to address Brenda's overreach. Maybe I escalated things unnecessarily. But I also learned something important. Institutions like HOAs only work when people hold them accountable. If nobody pushes back against petty tyrants, they just keep accumulating power until they've made everyone's life miserable. The 3 inches of snow that started everything seems almost comical now. Such a small thing to spark such a huge conflict. But it wasn't really about the snow. It was about respect, fairness, and the principle that rules should serve the community, not the egos of the people enforcing them. My mailbox still sits at the end of my driveway, same as always. Mail arrives 6 days a week without incident. My walkway gets shoveled when it needs to be, not because of threats, but because that's what responsible homeowners do. And the rock salt in my garage remains unused, a reminder that sometimes the best weapon against unreasonable authority is simply refusing to play by their rules. The HOA still exists, of course. We still have bylaws and board meetings and community standards. But under Mark and David's leadership, it's become what it should have been all along. A way for neighbors to work together to maintain property values and build community, not a tool for one person to impose their will on everyone else. I paid off all the legitimate HOA fees and settled my account. The invalid fines from Brenda's tenure were forgiven as part of the board's reform efforts. Several other homeowners also received refunds for questionable fines from the previous years. The HOA's bank account took a hit, but Patricia Donnelly argued convincingly that it was necessary to rebuild trust with the community. On a Friday evening in late October, almost a year after the first snow incident, the HOA threw a neighborhood block party. It was David's idea, a way to bring everyone together and move past the drama of the previous months. They closed off Oak Street, set up grills and picnic tables, and invited all 161 households. I almost didn't go. Part of me worried it would be awkward, that people would whisper about that guy who got Brenda arrested. But David convinced me, promising that enough time had passed, and enough people were grateful that I'd be welcomed. He was right. I showed up around 6 with a case of beer and a bag of chips, expecting to make an appearance and leave early. Instead, I spent 4 hours eating burgers, playing cornhole with the Morrison kids, and talking with neighbors I'd barely known despite living there for over 2 years. Mark Stevens clinked a bottle against his glass around 8 o'clock and made a short speech. I just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. The past year has been challenging for our community, but I think we've come out stronger. We've learned that HOAs work best when we focus on bringing people together, not driving them apart. So here's to Meadowbrook Estates, to good neighbors, and to the future. Everyone cheered. I caught David's eye across the crowd, and he raised his beer in a private toast. We'd done it. We'd taken a dysfunctional, toxic HOA situation and turned it into something functional. It wouldn't stay perfect, nothing involving people and rules ever does, but it was better. Much better. As I walked home that night, slightly buzzed and full of surprisingly good potato salad, I thought about Brenda again. I wondered if she was watching from her window 4 streets over, seeing the community celebrate without her. I wondered if she felt regret or just resentment. I hoped it was regret, that maybe she'd learned something from all of this, but I'd probably never know. What I did know was that I'd learned something. I'd learned that standing up for yourself matters, even when it's uncomfortable. I'd learned that communities are only as healthy as the people willing to speak up when something's wrong. And I'd learned that sometimes the smallest conflicts reveal the biggest character flaws. The snow came again that winter, as it always does in Illinois. December brought 4 inches overnight, and I woke up early to shovel before work. As I cleared my walkway and the public sidewalk, I saw other neighbors doing the same. David waved from across the street. The Morrisons' teenage son was shoveling their driveway, headphones in, probably complaining but doing it anyway. Nobody from the HOA drove around with a clipboard checking for violations. Nobody measured the exact time between snowfall cessation and snow removal. People just did what needed to be done because it was the right thing to do, and that made all the difference. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Coffee tomorrow morning. I want to talk about the spring landscaping proposals." I texted back. "Sounds good. 9 a.m. at Brood Awakening. Perfect." I finished shoveling, went inside and made breakfast. The morning sun was hitting my kitchen just right, streaming through the windows and warming the whole room. I had work to do, emails to answer, code to debug. But for a moment, I just stood there appreciating how peaceful everything felt. The HOA drama had been exhausting and frustrating and occasionally frightening. But it had also connected me to my community in ways I hadn't expected. I knew my neighbors now. I understood how the HOA worked and had a voice in its direction. I'd found friends and allies and a sense of belonging that I'd been missing since moving in. Was it worth it? The stress, the legal fees, the months of conflict. I thought about it honestly as I sipped my coffee. Yeah, it probably was. Not because I enjoyed fighting or because I got some thrill from taking down Brenda Patterson, but because communities need people who care enough to fight when things go wrong. If everyone just pays their unfair fines and accepts petty tyranny because it's easier than pushing back, then the tyrants win. And neighborhoods become places where rules matter more than people. I wasn't a hero. I was just a guy who got fed up with being bullied over 3 inches of snow and decided to push back. But sometimes that's enough. Sometimes one person refusing to accept injustice can start a cascade that leads to real change. The coffee was good. The sun was warm. My walkway was clear. Life was normal again in Meadowbrook Estates, and normal felt pretty damn great. Later that spring, the HOA held elections for the full board. 3 seats were open, and 12 people ran. The turnout was massive, with over 70% of homeowners voting. The 3 winners were all reasonable people who'd been vocal about supporting reform. Patricia Donnelly lost her re-election bid, not because anyone disliked her personally, but because people wanted a complete fresh start. David stayed on as board president. Mark Stevens remained as vice president. The new board's first major action was to revise the bylaws, streamlining them from 47 pages down to 22. They eliminated dozens of petty rules about things like lawn ornament placement and flower bed specifications. They raised the threshold for fines and created a transparent appeals process. The bylaws revision required a vote of all homeowners, and the meeting in June was packed. People asked questions, suggested amendments, and actually engaged with the process. When the final vote came, 83% approved the new bylaws. It was the highest participation rate in Meadowbrook Estates history. I didn't run for the board. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. But I stayed engaged, attended meetings when I could, and made sure to vote on important issues. That's all most homeowners need to do: pay attention and participate. The problems start when apathy lets the wrong people accumulate unchecked power. A year and a half after that first snowfall, I was sitting on my back deck on a Saturday afternoon, grilling burgers and reading a book. David and his wife came over with their kids. The Morrison family stopped by with homemade desserts. A few other neighbors drifted in, and what was supposed to be a quiet afternoon turned into an impromptu gathering. Someone mentioned Brenda at one point. They'd seen her at the grocery store, and apparently she'd been pleasant and normal. No clipboard, no aggressive demands about HOA compliance. Just a middle-aged woman buying groceries and going about her life. Think she learned anything? David asked. I considered the question. I hope so. Maybe losing everything made her realize what she'd become. Or maybe she's just lying low until her probation ends. I don't know. Either way, she's not our problem anymore, Mark Stevens said. He'd become a regular at these gatherings, bringing his famous potato salad and endless HOA war stories from his years on the board. True enough, I said, flipping a burger, but she's a reminder to stay vigilant. Power-hungry people are everywhere. They'll always find ways to make themselves feel important by making others miserable. "That's dark," David's wife said, laughing. "But true," Patricia Donnelly added. She'd shown up with wine and apologies, and we'd all agreed to let the past be the past. Every organization needs people who'll speak up. Otherwise, the Brendas of the world take over. We drank to that, toasting with beer and wine and lemonade. The conversation drifted to other topics: upcoming neighborhood events, local politics, someone's vacation plans. Normal stuff. Good stuff. As the sun set and people started heading home, I cleaned the grill and reflected on how much had changed. 2 years ago, I'd bought this house thinking the HOA would be a minor inconvenience at worst. I'd been naive, but I'd also been lucky. Lucky to have neighbors like David who were willing to stand up with me. Lucky to have a community that ultimately chose fairness over fear. Lucky that Brenda's worst impulses had been stopped before she could do permanent damage. The mailbox at the end of my driveway remained a symbol of everything that had happened. Every day when I checked the mail, I remembered the month without delivery, the investigation, the trial. But I also remembered that regular mail service resumed because people did the right thing. The system worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it worked. Winter came around again, as it always does. The first significant snowfall arrived in early December, 6 inches overnight. I woke up early, bundled up, and went outside to shovel. The work was meditative now, not a burden. Push, lift, toss. Push, lift, toss. Clear the walkway, clear the sidewalk, salt the steps. As I worked, I saw other driveways and sidewalks being cleared. The neighborhood was alive with the scraping of shovels and the hum of snow blowers. We were all doing our part, not because some tyrant demanded it, but because that's what neighbors do. We take care of our properties and look out for each other. My phone buzzed. A text from the HOA board. Reminder: community snow blower available for elderly/disabled residents. Contact board to arrange delivery. That was David's idea, using HOA funds to buy a snow blower that volunteers could take to residents who couldn't handle their own snow removal. Practical, compassionate, actually useful. The kind of thing HOAs should do. I finished my shoveling and went inside to warm up. Coffee, breakfast, another day of remote work. But first, I stood at my front window and looked out at the neighborhood. Smoke rose from chimneys. Christmas lights twinkled on several houses. Kids were already out building snowmen in front yards. Meadowbrook Estates wasn't perfect, no community is, but it was good, it was home. And that was enough. The rock salt sat in my garage, barely touched. I'd bought 3 bags that first winter when Brenda was fining people left and right, prepared to salt every inch of my property to avoid violations. Now, I used maybe half a bag per season, just for the steps where ice actually formed. Funny how things work out. A bag of rock salt had become my mental symbol of resistance, but I'd never actually needed it as a weapon. The real weapons had been persistence, documentation, and community support. Those intangibles mattered more than any amount of salt or snow removal or HOA compliance. I sat down at my computer to start work, but first, I checked the neighborhood Facebook group David had created. People were posting photos of the snow, complaining good-naturedly about the cold, sharing hot chocolate recipes. Someone had posted a meme about winter in Illinois that made me laugh. At the bottom of the feed, I noticed a post from a new homeowner asking about HOA rules. 3 people had already responded with helpful, friendly information. No scare tactics, no warnings about tyrants with clipboards, just neighbors helping neighbors understand the community standards. That's what it should be. That's what we'd fought for. And seeing it actually work, Seeing the community thrive under reasonable leadership made everything worthwhile. The snow outside my window was already starting to melt where the sun hit it. By afternoon, the roads would be clear. By tomorrow, you'd barely know it had snowed at all. That's the thing about winter in Illinois, it's harsh but temporary. Spring always comes. I thought about that first morning when Brenda had shown up at my door, clipboard in hand, ready to fine me for 3 inches of snow. If someone had told me then where that moment would lead, federal investigations, criminal trials, complete HOA reform, I wouldn't have believed them. But that's life. Small moments cascade into large consequences. I didn't regret standing up to her. I didn't regret the fight, even with all its stress and complications. Because some fights need to happen. Some people need to be stopped. And some communities need someone willing to say, "No, this isn't right and I'm not going to accept it." That person happened to be me in this place at this time. Tomorrow it might be someone else in a different neighborhood fighting different battles. But the principle remains the same. Don't accept petty tyranny. Don't let bullies win. And don't underestimate the power of one person refusing to comply with unjust rules. My coffee had gone cold while I was lost in thought. I reheated it in the microwave and settled in to start my workday. Code to write, meetings to attend, the normal rhythms of professional life. But in the back of my mind, I stayed alert, because vigilance matters, because communities need guardians, even part-time, reluctant ones like me. The snow would come again. Rules would need enforcing. Conflicts would arise. That's the nature of human communities. But as long as good people stayed engaged and spoke up when necessary, things would work out. Maybe not perfectly, but well enough. And well enough is actually pretty good. I glanced one more time at the window, at the snow-covered street and the neighbors going about their morning routines. Meadowbrook Estates, Illinois. My home. Imperfect, complicated, occasionally frustrating, but ultimately good. And I'd do whatever it took to keep it that way.